Fast food is usually framed as a modern invention, a response to factories, office hours, and crowded streets. It is associated with speed, convenience, and a lack of time, something that belongs to the industrial and post-industrial world, not to antiquity. Yet in the ruins of Pompeii, a different story appears. Along its stone streets, beneath faded frescoes and chipped counters, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of small food shops built directly into the fabric of the city. They were designed for quick service. They sold ready-made meals, and they existed not on the margins of society, but at its center. For the people of Pompeii, eating outside the home was not unusual, it was normal. In some cases, it was unavoidable. The idea of fast food did not begin with modern cities. It emerged the moment cities became dense, unequal, and busy. Pompeii was already living that reality. Roman daily life is often imagined through the lens of wealth. Literature, art, and surviving architecture disproportionately reflect the experiences of the elite. Large houses with atriums, private gardens, and multiple dining rooms dominate reconstructions of Roman culture. But these homes belonged to a minority. Most residents of Pompeii lived in far smaller spaces. Many rented rooms or apartments located above shops and workshops. These living quarters were often dark, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Archaeological remains show that many lacked permanent hearths or dedicated cooking spaces. Cooking was not only inconvenient, it was dangerous. Pompeii's buildings were tightly packed and fire spread easily. Excavations reveal repeated evidence of fire damage and rebuilding across the city long before the eruption. Open flames inside upper-story apartments posed a serious risk not just to individuals, but to entire neighborhoods. Roman urban life was therefore structured differently from the modern ideal of the private household. Meals were not always prepared where people slept. Food production and food consumption were distributed across the city. For many Pompeians, daily nourishment came not from the kitchen, but from the street. The Thermopolium was the physical expression of this urban food system. A Thermopolium was a small, permanent food establishment built directly onto the street. Its defining feature was a masonry counter, often L-shaped, with large ceramic jars embedded into the surface. These jars held prepared food and drink, ready to be served to passers-by. Behind the counter was a compact working area used for storage and preparation. Space was minimal. These were not places designed for sitting or lingering. Customers stood at the counter or took their food elsewhere. Pompeii contains one of the highest concentrations of Thermopolia ever discovered in a Roman city. More than 80 have been identified, distributed across nearly every district. Their placement was strategic. Many were located near intersections, public baths, fountains, markets, and city gates, areas with heavy foot traffic. Decoration played a functional role. Painted panels on counters and walls depicted food items, animals, and serving vessels. These images likely acted as visual advertisements, communicating offerings in a society where literacy was not universal. The architecture of Thermopolia reveals careful planning. They were not improvised stalls, they were permanent fixtures integrated into the urban landscape. Fast food existed in Pompeii because the city demanded it. Urban density was a defining feature of Roman cities. Pompeii's streets were narrow, its buildings closely spaced, and its population compressed into a limited area. This density placed strain on infrastructure, particularly water supply, waste removal, and fire prevention. Cooking inside residential buildings intensified these risks. Fires could spread rapidly through wooden beams and upper floors. Roman authorities were aware of the danger, and while regulations existed, enforcement was uneven. Reducing domestic cooking was one way the city adapted. Fuel costs added another constraint. Charcoal and firewood were not freely available. Procuring, storing, and maintaining fuel required money, space, and time. For individuals living alone or in rented rooms, buying prepared food could be cheaper than cooking regularly. Time pressure was equally significant. Pompeii was a working city. Bakers, fullers, metal workers, porters, shopkeepers, and enslaved laborers followed demanding schedules. Many began work early in the morning and continued until evening. Meals had to fit into these routines. Thermopolia allowed people to eat quickly without returning home. They also allowed employers to delegate food procurement, sending enslaved workers to purchase meals rather than preparing them internally. Fast food in Pompeii was not a cultural oddity. It was a rational adaptation to urban constraints. It functioned as part of the city's economic and social infrastructure. The food sold in Thermopolia was practical rather than luxurious. Bread formed the basis of most meals. Pompeii had numerous bakeries equipped with large stone mills and ovens, indicating mass production. Bread was sold throughout the city and eaten plain or combined with other foods. Prepared dishes often took the form of stews. These included legumes such as lentils, beans, and chickpeas, along with vegetables and grains. When available, small quantities of meat were added, most commonly pork or poultry. Fish and shellfish were also consumed, reflecting Pompeii's access to the coast. Wine was a daily staple. It was rarely consumed undiluted and was often mixed with water, herbs, or sweeteners. Thermopolia served wine alongside food, sometimes warmed or spiced. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was a central flavoring agent. Produced in large quantities around Pompeii, it added salt and protein to simple meals. Amphorae stamped with Pompeian producers have been found across the Roman world. Scientific analysis supports these conclusions. Residue testing of ceramic jars has identified traces of wine, grains, legumes, and animal fats. Frescoes depicting food items reinforce the archaeological findings. This was everyday food, designed for sustenance rather than display. Thermopolia served the majority of Pompeii's population. They were frequented by laborers, artisans, dock workers, travelers, and residents of apartment buildings without proper cooking facilities. They were also used extensively by enslaved people sent to purchase food for households. Public eating crossed legal and social boundaries. Free citizens, freedmen, enslaved individuals, and foreigners all used the same spaces. What differed was perception. Elite Romans generally avoided eating in Thermopolia. In Roman culture, status was expressed through control of private space. Dining at home, hosting guests, and displaying abundance were markers of respectability and power. Eating in public, especially at small street counters, suggested necessity rather than choice. Roman authors sometimes portrayed these establishments as morally questionable, associating them with gambling, drinking, or idleness. These critiques reveal more about elite anxieties than about daily reality. The sheer number of Thermopolia makes clear that public dining was not marginal, it was fundamental to how the city functioned. For many Pompeians, Thermopolia were not a last resort, they were the primary source of prepared food. Public food inevitably raised concerns. Roman authorities attempted to regulate commercial activity, including food and drink establishments. Certain areas of the city imposed restrictions, particularly near temples or elite residences. Taverns and Thermopolia were sometimes grouped together and monitored. Food quality was a recurring concern in Roman literature. Without refrigeration, preservation relied on salt, fermentation, and rapid consumption. Spoilage was a known risk, especially in warm climates. Writers warned against dishonest practices, such as diluting wine or selling inferior ingredients. These complaints indicate both consumer awareness and the existence of standards, even if enforcement was inconsistent. Archaeological evidence shows variation. Some thermopolia were carefully maintained, with clean counters, decorative frescoes, and organized storage. Others show heavy wear, graffiti, and minimal upkeep. Hygiene standards were not uniform, but these establishments operated openly. They were part of the city's regulated economy, visible to customers and authorities alike.
The presence of Thermopolia did more than feed Pompeii's population. It actively shaped how the city functioned. Their locations were not random. Archaeological mapping shows that Thermopolia clustered along the busiest streets, especially near intersections, city gates, bath complexes, and marketplaces. These were places where people naturally gathered, passed through, or paused during the day. Major streets, such as the Via dell'Abbondanza, contained multiple food establishments within short walking distances. This density suggests intentional placement. Food access followed movement. Thermopolia positioned themselves where daily traffic was guaranteed. Public baths offer a particularly clear example. Bathing was a routine activity in Roman life, often followed by eating and socializing. Thermopolia, located nearby, benefited from predictable surges in customers. The relationship between baths and food shops reflects an integrated urban rhythm rather than isolated businesses. Fountains played a similar role. Pompeii's public water system distributed fresh water through street fountains, which became natural meeting points. Food shops nearby capitalized on this flow of people, reinforcing the street as a shared social space. This arrangement influenced how Pompeians moved through the city. Meals were not destinations in themselves. They were woven into daily routes between work, home, baths, and public buildings. Eating became part of circulation rather than interruption. Thermopolia also shaped social interaction. Because they operated in public view, they created informal gathering points. Short exchanges at counters, repeated encounters with vendors, and shared routines contributed to neighborhood familiarity. These were not anonymous transactions, they were embedded in local networks. From an economic perspective, Thermopolia reveals a city organized around small-scale commerce. They required suppliers, bakers, fishermen, farmers, and transport networks. Food sold at street counters was the visible endpoint of a much larger system. Urban planning in Pompeii did not separate residential, commercial, and social spaces into distinct zones. Instead, these functions overlapped. Thermopolia exemplifies this integration. They existed where people lived, worked, and moved. The city was not designed around private consumption. It was designed around shared infrastructure. Food access was part of that system. In this way, fast food was not merely a response to Pompeii's urban life, it was one of the forces shaping it.
When Mount Vesuvius erupted, Pompeii was engaged in ordinary life. Shops were open, the streets were active, food was being prepared and sold. Several thermopolia were sealed with food still inside their jars, counters facing the street as they had every day. The eruption preserved these spaces with unusual clarity. Ash-filled rooms hardened and protected architectural details. What remains is not a moment of spectacle, but a record of routine. Pompeii preserves the mechanisms of daily survival, how people ate, where they gathered, how the city sustained itself. Pompeii challenges modern assumptions about convenience. Fast food is not a modern failure or shortcut. It is an urban solution. Wherever cities concentrate people, labor, and time pressure, similar systems emerge. The Thermopolia of Pompeii reveals a city responding pragmatically to its conditions: limited space, limited time, unequal resources. The technologies differ, but the patterns remain. In the stone counters of Pompeii's streets, the ancient city feels unexpectedly familiar, not because it resembles modern life perfectly, but because it responds to the same pressures. Pompeii does not show a distant past, it shows a city doing what cities have always done, finding ways to feed people efficiently, every day.